Hi, welcome everyone. This is another one of our Global Speaker Series events, and I'm really excited to have Mr. Quincy Lissaur here. He is from Colombia, if I'm pronouncing it right, Medellin in Antioquia, Colombia.
Yeah, so I'm based out of Medellin, that's right.
Excellent. So we're joining him, or he's joining us live here today. We're going to be talking about what kind of business acumen does it take to build public-private partnerships on an international level. And what I'm going to ask Quincy to do is go ahead and introduce yourself. I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler. I'm your professor and host. And I have to admit, I'm very honored, and I feel it's a great privilege to be able to have a network filled with so many fine people that are willing to share their story and to share some insights and provide an opportunity for students to listen real time not really one-on-one, but listen in real time to their perspectives and their experience. And Quincy Lissaur is no exception. Seriously, an incredible amount of experience from his perspective, and to share his insights on public-private partnerships is an incredible opportunity. And I love the fact that I get to learn of these things as well. Quincy, go ahead. Would you please kind of describe where you work, what you do, what your role is? I know you're currently in a leadership role with at least 2 entities. Maybe shed a little insight on that for us.
Sure, Darren, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you today. I actually had 12 students from Groningen University in the Netherlands over for drinks last night. So it was a little bit of a hazy morning this morning. Thank God that this doesn't have to happen 2 days in a row, but I'm quite excited to be here with some leading students from Northeastern. So in terms of my own personal background, I'm Dutch by origin. I was raised in the Netherlands until I was 12. My parents then were posted in Brazil. I went to an American high school there, and then was given the choice to either go back to the Netherlands for university or head to the US. So I ended up studying at Babson College, which I'm sure everybody at Northeastern knows is just up the road out in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Got a degree in entrepreneurship and marketing, and then as you do, you start working for a consultancy firm. So I was hired by a small niche consultancy firm called IF Consulting that specializes in strategy consulting around indirect channels to go to market. So things like franchising, agents, new market opening, etc. Did that for 4 years. They moved me to London, and then I got headhunted by the British Standards Institution, BSI, where I was based for about 9 years to help them in within their standards division. They'd set up a consultancy and advisory unit to help particularly large multinationals around the implementation of standards, the development of fast track standards that were more directly correlated to the needs of particularly the private sector. There I ended up doing a lot of standards in the food space. So Darin, you're probably quite familiar with ISO 22000. That had a particular gap in it, in that it didn't have the prerequisite programs or the PRPs in it. So I was responsible for the development of a whole series of standards that ultimately could help the implementation of ISO 22000 with its PRPs that ultimately then led to the FSSC 22000 program. That's kind of how I ended up rolling into the food sector. And then in 2012, I started up my own consultancy. And shortly after, I got a call from a number of SAFE board members to ask whether or not I might be interested in becoming their executive director on a part-time basis. I said, sure, but I'm probably moving to Colombia. They said, well, that's not a problem. Our members are based everywhere between New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, US, all over Europe. So it doesn't really matter where you're based, so long as you're able to do the job for us that we need you to do for us. And that's how I ended up becoming the executive director of SAFE just over 10 years ago. And that's how I kind of rolled into the work that I do today. I do that on a part-time basis, and then I work for a number of other clients. One is a certification body out of Ohio, and then until September of last year, I was also the honorary consul of the Netherlands here in Medellin as well. So I've had a number of hats that I've worn throughout the years.
Well, it sounds like it's almost as if there's like this magnetic field around your hats that is so far away in terms of how many different jurisdictions, government entities, government drawn lines that your hats end up crossing. And I think that, we say the phrases like the world's becoming smaller because of the internet and technology, but as we have more global supply, as we have more buyers and sellers and distribution and international organizations that are overseeing, how can we be talking the same language? How can we be meeting the same standards? You have to have an acumen that allows you to relate and understand and communicate and network with so many different entities. And it sounds like that's that's something that you're doing there.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. I'm going to put it into presentation mode. Let's see. Can you see that properly? Can you see the full screen?
I do. And students can see this too, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'll give a little bit of background about SAFE, because exactly those points that you mentioned there, Darin, are absolutely fundamental, right? I mean, if you look at my membership covering pretty much the entire food supply chain from farm to fork, and you probably have within our membership about 50% of the world food supply chain. Yeah, international markets are fundamental. Regulatory compliance in different jurisdictions is key to their business. If they produce something in Indonesia and they want to export it to Vietnam, what are the rules that they need to comply with? Obviously, they don't want to be building factories in every single jurisdiction, but obviously the requirements then within the factory are going to be quite different depending, or can be quite different depending on which jurisdiction that they want to sell in. So those are some of the challenges that our members face. If I go back first and talk a little bit about why SAFE was founded and what it is that we do, we actually came out of the avian influenza crisis in 2003. And unfortunately, we're facing an H5N1 crisis in Brazil right now. So just down the door, for the very first time ever, avian influenza has been found in Brazil. So we're going to probably be seeing some interesting things coming out of there in the next 6 months, given that Brazil is the largest poultry supplier to the world. But one of the challenges that a couple of our members had was they were unable to export cooked poultry out of China into Southeast Asia, South Korea, and Japan. And the main reason why is countries just closed their borders and said, no, we're not taking any chicken from China. They said, well, hold on a second. We're adhering here to the, well, at the time it was called OIE, now WOA, the World Organization of Animal Health Standards. And yet the countries are not accepting them. So they flew over to Paris and met with Dr. Bernard Vallat, who was the Director General at the time, and said to them, look, we want to export. We're going to end up in a massive food crisis here if we aren't able to export cooked poultry out of China. So how do we work with you as WOA or OIE at the time? And how do we make sure that countries do follow the WOA standards? So Dr. Vallat said, look, I'd love to work with you guys, but I can't just work with one or two companies. Why don't you look at setting up a public-private partnership that brings together the intergovernmental organizations, the private sector, academia, and NGOs to work collaboratively on emerging issues that affect the safe supply and trade of food around the world. So these two gentlemen, or three gentlemen actually, they went off, probably had some very good wine that evening, and on the back of a napkin wrote up the whole concept behind SAFE, went back in the next day and said, okay, OIE, we want to work with you. We are going to set up a PPP. And we also want to start an educational program, not only at government level to get people to start adhering to the OIE standards, but also on top of that, we want to do an educational program for Chinese consumers, because Chinese New Year was just around the corner and they wanted to avoid the further spreading of avian influenza across China. And that's really where SAFE came from. And that's still very much what we hold on to today. So in a nutshell, what we do as an organization is, one is we're set up as a nonprofit. We're incorporated out of Minnesota as a 501c3. It's a membership organization that anybody can be a member of. And in the past, we had some NGOs as well as academic institutions, and particularly MSU, who used to be members of SSAFE. The whole concept around SSAFE is to work collaboratively to protect human, plant, and animal health under the One Health concept by responding quickly to emerging issues that affect the safe supply and trade of food around the world. As I showed you, obviously, these are our members. We have 11 members, and we're very small by design because it allows us to be agile, to be nimble, and to be effective, and to very quickly respond to those emerging issues. On top of that, obviously, our collective expertise within our membership, as well as with our partners, allows us to really develop some impactful solutions. And what we then do with that, and what are our activities, is basically threefold. We undertake projects and develop tools that we give away for free, mainly through our website. We share good practices within our membership, but most importantly, really, is we collaborate with our external partners, and in particular intergovernmental partners. And those are still very much WOA, World Organization of Animal Health, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, Codex Alimentarius, and the WTO through the STDF. So the World Trade Organization has a department there that's called the Standards and Trade Development Facility, run by a gentleman called Melvin Sprey. So we work very closely with them as well. And why? Because again, food, plant, and animal health come together under Codex through FAO, the animal health part in WOA, and ultimately, if you want to trade food across borders, the WTO is a core component of that as well. And that is why we've designed SSAFE to work the way that we do.
So if I can paraphrase here, in a world where we have governments, we have academic institutions, we have institutes, organizations, NGOs, so many different things, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can all work together. And SSAFE, as this platform where you have this public-private partnership, it becomes almost this thread that's able to weave in and out of all these different entities and their specific agendas and their specific kind of unique obstacles, and try to find solutions and support the idea of circumventing what might have been some obstacles if there wasn't this public-private partnership.
Absolutely. And again, Darin, you need to go back 20 years, right? 20 years ago, the private sector was seen and looked upon by the public sector, and particularly intergovernmental organizations, and to some extent national regulators, as being evil, right? All they were in for was to make money, and they weren't there to really do good by consumers, do good by the environment, do good by nutrition, do good by a lot of different areas. And even though they did, it was very much seen upon as, hey, you're in this just to make money and satisfy the bottom line of your shareholders. So that really was the core driver behind setting this up as a public-private partnership, right? Because that really allowed us to bring together the different types of organizations around the world to speak openly and freely amongst each other, not to benefit the bottom line, but really for the greater good. So if I go to the next slide, really public-private partnerships is a partnership between the public and the private sector. The World Bank defines it as a long-term contract between private parties and government agencies to provide public assets or services in which the private party bears a significant amount of risk, management responsibility, and part of the financing. Now, again, the way to think about that is very much about building roads or bridges or tunnels or those kind of things. They are not the only way in which public-private partnerships are defined. So it's not only for large-scale public work activities, but also nonprofit organizations like SSAFE. The core element behind this, though, is not to lobby. So if I go to the next slide here, really there are three core elements that we believe that a public-private partnership does that ultimately drives our goal of developing trust between the public and the private sector. And that is collaboration. And that collaboration is very much around discussing the issues that we are currently facing and driving mutual understanding around those issues and challenges. So us understanding the perspective of the intergovernmental organizations, and the intergovernmental organizations understanding the realities of what happens, for example, on the factory floor or on a farm. And ultimately then also join some funding, so you're then able to work collaboratively on developing solutions to those particular issues or challenges.
I'm really liking these two graphic organizers, because I mean, I've been in situations where people want me to help. They say, look, we can't do this. We need someone who's kind of like a middle person to help us do this. And all of a sudden they start asking me, am I an officer or an owner of a company? Do I have on the New York Stock Exchange? So they want to know about the idea of securities and exchange conflicts and other things. So there's a lot of questionnaires I end up having to fill out, and regulations and NDAs that I have to follow in terms of being someone that doesn't violate. It's not even so much what I do, it's more along the lines of being in partnership with an entity and having some characteristics that violates their regulatory alignments or their government standards they have to meet, or the conditions they have to meet in order to stay within their status. And so this idea of developing trust sometimes takes an outside organization to help do that. And I like how you really focus on the idea of trust here as the goal.
And it very much is, right? One is we don't lobby. The moment you start lobbying, you're basically out of this space, right? If we go knocking on the door at FAO or at Codex and start suggesting what they should or shouldn't be doing, we're done. We might as well close shop. That is not what we're here to do. We are here to really understand the challenges and the way that they are looking at it, and the challenges that they've got are vast, because I mean, again, it's a UN institution. They've got 192 members, yeah, and FAO can't just go out and start doing whatever it wants, because before you know it, you've got China or the US or the European Union or Brazil or Australia knocking on their door and saying, what the hell are you guys doing? Yeah, so they can't just, they've got a lot of paymasters behind them driving the standards and the policy documents that they push out into the world, right? So if we're going to go in there, we're going to start telling FAO or WOA or Codex what they should be doing, and we might as well go home. So if I go to the next slide, actually, I think that describes this world a little bit better. So the way that we look at it is I mean, you could basically invert the pyramid as well, but at the top end, all of this really starts at the global level, particularly within the food sector with Codex Alimentarius, right? So the standards from Codex are fundamental. Why? Because they are the ones that also underpin national regulation and ultimately trade in food around the world, because Codex standards are recognized by the WTO in terms of trade disputes. So if, for example, a particular Codex standard is implemented in the US, but is not implemented in Italy, for example, the US could potentially take Italy to court under WTO rules for not complying with the Codex standards and stopping US producers to export specific products into Italy, yeah, just as an example. So that is very much at the global level. At the regional level, then you've got the EU, you've got the Mercosur here in South America, you've got TPP, well, which obviously has never come off the ground, but hopefully there's a chance that is going to come back to the table again. You've then got national regulation and government departments, and then ultimately end up in the local space as well, cities, local authorities, state authorities, etc. Particularly in the US, that is important, given the fact that you basically have 50 states, meaning 50 regulatory environments within the US as well. So that's why the US tends to be a little bit complex when you're trying to export products into the US, because you need to comply at state as well as at federal level. So that just demonstrates the overall global complexity. And if you don't understand this particular picture, you end up in a situation where you're going to have a really hard time to sell food products, both nationally as well as internationally.
Well, and whether we're talking about food products or other non-food products, there are different concerns, whether it's the amount of lead in them or different chemicals. Definitely, with food, you look at allergens. One of the students, Jordan, brought up the idea or the question here about happening in France when they didn't want GMOs in their country. And what is GMO's definition? What is the standards? If you don't have this kind of a sense of the international standards, you're talking, you know, you can't talk if what's approved in one country and what's approved in another country, but we're not kind of settling on what is that approval. And if I want to import export, how do I make sure I'm meeting these standards?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you've got the regulatory standards, right? So those really start here at this top level here at a global level through Codex Alimentarius and then recognized by the WTO. GMO versus non-GMO, growth hormones is another big topic that has obviously been discussed for many, many years, and where there is conflict between the US and Europe. And then so you need those particular standards, because without that kind of harmonization in the long run, all it does is drive further complexity, more confusion among consumers. Back to your point from earlier, Darin, that the world is getting smaller, consumers are getting smarter. I mean, I've had people, friends of mine, ask me like, hold on a second, how come I can't get, for example, a wasabi Kit Kat, but I can get a chocolate Kit Kat? Why can't I get that here? I want to buy it online. I can buy it off Amazon in the US, but it won't allow me to import it into Colombia. It's like, well, very simple. It doesn't meet the national regulatory requirements here in Colombia.
Right. And a lot of people are surprised when there are chemicals and ingredients that are banned in certain countries, but you'll find them on the box of a cereal or whatever in the US. Or there you go. Someone brought up high fructose corn syrup. It's not just that it's high fructose corn syrup. It's here are these different names for the same thing, and what is the percentages of these different things. And then there's other elements like the Kinder Surprise. Anyone familiar with Kinder Surprise toys? They used to have very small, someone says yes, they used to have very small plastic toy pieces in there. So like it used to be an outer egg, you open it up, you could eat the egg. And inside there was these little teeny things and you could assemble something. That's great until you realize that that's a choking hazard for children, or that there's lead in the plastic. And now all of a sudden we got different standards. And so there was a while where it's like, you can't buy this here, but you can go up to Canada and buy this, or you can't buy it in Canada, but you can buy it here. This is some of those different standards when you go from place to place that you're looking at that ends up meaning, why is it that, a box of Kellogg cereal that says, that's what we see right now. If I go to the closest grocery store, well, I can see that same box of cereal if I go to other countries, but the label's going to show a vast difference of ingredients and elements in that box than when I buy it on the shelves here in the Los Angeles area.
Absolutely. And Darin, that is primarily driven by risk tolerances, right? So the risk tolerance in certain countries for certain types of foods and ingredients is different than it is in others. And to that extent, there does definitely need to be some flexibility also to enable and allow for innovation in the long run. Yet it does make food production a lot more complicated, and at times can lead to significant food waste. So as we start looking towards the future, and we are talking about sustainability, and we want to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17, one of the big challenges that we have is the contrasting nature of certain aspects within those Sustainable Development Goals. You adjust the dial here and you screw up a dial over there. Right. And that's only if you're talking one-to-one. Sometimes you're talking about 5 or 6 different types of impacts. So food waste in that respect is also a very, very big topic in conversation that we keep a close eye on. And we do have discussions with some of our intergovernmental partners about, because we want to reduce food waste. We want to make sure that we can feed the world as we grow from 8 billion to 10 billion people in the next 25 years. How do we make sure that we do that, right? And the only way that we can do that is in part by reducing food waste. Well, maybe we need need to adjust our risk tolerances in certain parts of the world.
I'm glad you brought up risks because, here, even if we're talking about food, there are risks that don't sound like the normal kind of risks. For instance, labeling requirements in one country are different than labeling requirements in a different country. For a while, all meat that came out of the United States and went out to the United States, I'm sorry, all meat that came out of the US going up into Canada, if it was mechanically tenderized, like needle or blade tenderized, it had to be labeled as such. But in the United States, they didn't have to write those, they didn't have to have that labeling on there. You also have risks, even this doesn't sound like it's food related at all, global data protection regulations. You have some countries that have much more higher levels of restrictions on them in terms of their data collection, storage, security than in other places. That must make it difficult for these global public-private partnerships to deal, because now you're dealing with information, even with NDAs, you're dealing with information out of different countries, and you've got to kind of deal with the security of the information you have at the most restrictive level, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned data sharing there. That is a conversation that we have quite frequently with certain regulators. At our board meeting in Atlanta back in April, we had a conversation with somebody from the FDA there to talk about the new traceability rule in FSMA. And we are strong supporters of the FSMA rule. The devil, though, is in the detail and how you implement it. And the FDA goes, look, we want you to share more data with us. And the private sector says, look, we're more than happy to share data, but it needs to go both ways. We're happy to share data with you, anonymized, and for you to then share some of that information back so we can act upon it again on the level of risk, right? If you guys identify an area of risk, or maybe you guys share data with us that we can then, through our own internal systems, analyze quite effectively, that data then will be extremely beneficial, not only to us, but we can then share that back with you again afterwards, after we've done our analysis, and potentially identify areas of risk that need to be addressed either through regulation or through industry-driven standards like ISO.
Yeah, and that data element is not just about political borders. When the CDC tried to get permission in a major outbreak to be able to get membership loyalty, like loyalty cards, if you have a card for this grocery store, a card for that grocery store, that they would be able to collect data and look at anyone who bought these foods during this period of time, and then they could communicate with them. The major grocery store chains are like, no, we own that data. We are not going to give that data up to anyone, let alone the government, because they see it as their ownership, their property. So it's not just legal issues around data; it's the idea of data being seen as property of these companies. And your earliest slide, I believe it was, you had some companies up there that are they're competitors, and they would normally think, why would we ever share our data with these other there you go, why would some of these companies ever share their data with each other in traditional business to business dealings? But I would imagine that these public-private partnerships allow for some ways for these different companies to potentially at least share some elements of their data and to not violate any kind of NDAs or security,
Antitrust.
SEC, antitrust, exactly, situations.
Yeah, so we're covered under antitrust rules, and really what we tend to work on tend to be issues that are pre-competitive, right? So food safety is a pre-competitive issue. Some of the other areas that we work on as well. There isn't so much data sharing amongst the members, but you know what, Darin, it comes back to that element of trust. I would challenge any retailer that goes back and says, well, I'm not going to share the data with you because it's our property. Yeah, it's like, yeah, but hold on a second, guys. It is about consumer safety. It is about protecting mankind, and that surely trumps any of your data as such that you commercialize. Ultimately, if you're trying to protect the consumer, you need to be able to, you need to share that data with the government and vice versa. Now, in my experience, there tends to be a lot more distrust of government in the US than there is, for example, in Europe. There are historical reasons behind that. I mean, we can go into that, but that probably would take us at least another hour discussion right there. Nonetheless, if we are trying to develop trust between the public and private sector, which is one of the core elements of what we try to do as SAFE, sharing information is absolutely fundamental. And hiding behind like, well, that is our proprietary data. I'm sorry, people's names and what they may or may not have consumed in order to protect them from a foodborne outbreak? Absolutely not. I would always challenge any retailer or any company to say, no, surely consumer safety trumps your commercial data and your commercial imperative there.
Let's take a slight break here, and let's bring in the students rather than waiting to the end. Are there any questions or thoughts from students? I had some questions from students, and I think you've addressed some of them. The idea of biggest challenges in establishing and maintaining some of these public-private partnerships. But one question was about keeping all actors involved in a PPP motivated on the same page with the concerns in relation to deliverables and goals. How difficult is to keep everyone, once you've got them, to keep them on track and on board and motivated?
I love that question. That's very difficult. That's the simple part in order to answer that one. In reality, the way that we look at it as SAFE is a problem for one is a problem for all. So let me give you a great example, right? Compass is our most recent member, right? As the largest catering service company in the world. And for those who on the call don't know Compass Group, they probably do the catering of most universities in the US. They do hospitals, they do prisons, they do office buildings, they do stadia, right? So if you go to Fenway, they probably do the catering at Fenway for a number of different restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very much at the restaurant end of the supply chain for most of their services. They do a lot of other stuff as well, and it's always an interesting company for you guys to look at. On the other hand, we've got Tyson and Cargill, who are two of the largest chicken producers in the world, right? So Tom Ford, who is our member from Compass Group, he and I were having a conversation the other day because on and off we've been having some conversations with the Blue Ribbon Task Force for Salmonella. If we look at Salmonella, the numbers in the US over the last 25 to 30 years have not really come down. And we're looking at anywhere between 25 to 32% Salmonella in chicken that comes out of slaughterhouses. What Tom basically tells me is, look, Quincy, if there is something that we can do with Cargill, with Tyson, McDonald's, ourselves, sit around the table and say, okay, what active things can we do to reduce salmonella in chicken? And let's say that we are able to reduce it from 30% to 15%. That's a 50% reduction. He goes, that reduces my risk at the restaurant level by 50% as well. Because if I have a young student, 17, 18, 19, manning the grill at Fenway Park, for example, and they undercook the chicken, if I have just reduced by 50% the possibility that there's salmonella in that chicken, I've just reduced 50% of a customer getting ill at Fenway. Yeah. So it's like a problem for us, or a problem for Cargill and Tyson is also a problem for us. So it comes right across the entire supply chain. Now, that's one thing. Second thing is, not every topic is of direct interest to all of my members, but they do say, look, ultimately, what we are doing here is for the greater good, right? We are here to strengthen the food supply chain. And even though a particular activity may not directly impact our business, we know that it's for the greater good of everybody. And that is why we pool the money. That's why our members pay their annual membership fee, so that together they can work on strengthening the safe supply and trade of food, right? And on a global basis. And even though a particular project may not, or a particular tool that we develop may not specifically benefit Givaudan or Nestle or Mars, yeah, they do see the bigger picture in all this and the value that it ultimately generates for the food sector as a whole. That's how we keep them interested.
So it sounds like the conversation can be starting from this idea of, look, when you look at corporate social responsibility, you have your economic and your government responsibility, your legal responsibilities. But when you start participating in some of these public-private partnerships, now you start looking at not only your ethical, but even your philanthropic responsibilities in terms of the idea of looking beyond self, contributing to the bigger sector. And that if you're trying to contribute to the sector such that you're solving a problem upstream, not only does that solve the problem for you, it solves or lessens some of those risks, thus liabilities for, even if it's your competitor. You can't have seen that improvement with yourself if you weren't working in these partnerships to try to raise the improvement, whether it's lowering the numbers of this or raising numbers of that, such that ultimately there's an improvement. You can't necessarily affect that change unless you're working in some of these partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Darin, if you look at our website and all the tools that we have developed, and again, because of a 501c3, I have the luxury of being able to give them away for free. I don't need to charge for any of the tools that we ultimately develop. They're developed with the leading expertise from the leading food companies around the world, but the real benefit tends to be for small and medium-sized businesses, not only in developed markets like the US and Europe, but also in developing markets, right? Like a Colombia or a Ghana or a Madagascar, right? So take, for example, vanilla, right? A lot of our tools Givaudan is using with their vanilla suppliers out of Madagascar, right? So again, a lot of this work isn't there to specifically benefit SSAFE member companies, right? So it's not to benefit those who are directly participating in our public-private partnership, but actually for much smaller businesses. And that really comes back down to capacity and capability building around the world and providing the food sector with the tools to help strengthen the safe supply of food.
Great. With our audience, with the students who have joined us here today, are there some questions that anyone has that you want to come on camera or type into the chat? Give people a second here.
I put one in the chat and it
goes. Go ahead. That's Jordan, right? I can't see who's.
Yeah. It goes back to what Quincy was saying about using that available data and making those laws and creating these partnerships and collaborations using that data that's proven for the greater health of mankind and safety. And when that data has shown, such as like in the European Union, certain countries banning the use of these carcinogenic herbicides, while the US, who's got the same data, right? Well, the EU's determined that, like, hey, this causes cancer, we're not putting it in our food. The same data is being used by the US and being like, well, oh well. How do you broker a productive conversation when one side is willingly ignoring that data for the health of mankind?
Yeah, so ultimately there, Jordan, the way that we look at it is you need to go back to the science, right? And you need to look at what are the scientific, what's the scientific data that underpins this? How is it interpreted? And then it goes back to the point that we were making earlier, which is what is your tolerance in terms of level of risk, right? And there clearly the US has a different tolerance level in terms of risk of carcinogenics in this particular case, as opposed to the EU. The argument, as far as I understand it, is that the science hasn't really proven, at least on the US side, they're saying that the science hasn't really proven the level of carcinogenics and its potential impact on human health, whereas in the EU, they're taking a much lower level of tolerance. And we're starting to see that more and more in Europe anyway, where there were very little or no tolerances whatsoever, which in itself then also creates challenges. And the big problem there is very often, particularly because of time spans, you're talking about years, decades. Sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult to be able to determine in the short run what the long-term human health impact may or may not be.
Thank you. Garrett, you had a question. Are you able to ask? Are you able to ask the question, or you want me to ask it for you? Okay, so Garrett typed into the chat, when it comes to global differences in data, as well as the EU having different standards than the US, say in access to corporate data, how do you work to establish protocols that work on international scale? Or rather, is it better to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach?
That's a very good question. So there's two parts to that. So firstly, the way that we encourage it is through the global institutions, in particular Codex Alimentarius, and where there is no drive within Codex, we tend to encourage this work to be taken up in ISO. Why? Because the WTO recognizes ISO standards in the case where there aren't any Codex standards available. So that is their next step. So the way that we look at it, again, if you were to look at it as a ladder, the base really comes out of Codex. Where there's a lack of Codex, you go to ISO standards. From ISO standards, you go to national standards bodies. So for example, in the US, that would be ANSI, or in the UK, that would be BSI, the British Standards Institution, etc. And then we would encourage them to push those into ISO, while at the same time having dialogue with Codex to try to help them, to encourage them to take up that type of, to take up that standards development process. The other way to then do it is also have dialogue at national level, right? So the US representative in Codex is the FDA, the Food Standards Agency in the UK is their national representative, et cetera, et cetera. So the other way to go about it is to have a dialogue at a national basis, so that if you get enough support at a national basis, they can then take that into Codex. That's the way that we look at it. So the second part around the one size fits all, well, that kind of comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier around innovation, right? You definitely don't want to hamper innovation. And sometimes one size fits all doesn't actually work. It also then stops potential research, scientific research into the challenges around food safety, right? So we would always encourage innovation to be able to continue to flourish. And then, even though we do believe strongly in harmonization, one size fits all doesn't always necessarily lead to the best outcome.
Well, kind of segueing off this notion of one size fits all, I would imagine that for the students listening to this, when you saw that slide that had all those major companies, most of those companies you should notice, or you should recognize. When we're talking about these international public-private partnerships, you're not going to see Joe's Taquito store or Mary's Pancake Restaurant or whatever necessarily in these. You're looking at companies that have major international interdependency and dependency. They have markets. They're dealing with so many barriers, different markets. Even in the United States, we have certain differences between, if you look at like Target stores, for instance. I've worked with Target stores because one of the things that Target's looking at is that every single different, not just the states, but in some places within states, every single jurisdiction they go into, there's different laws and regulations in terms of regulatory compliance and some of the barriers that they have. And so here you have a multi-state company, the Target stores, that are trying to find ways to find common language and even use partnerships to broker a better situation for them because it benefits them. And they know that that's going to benefit their competitors as well, but there's no way they can break through some of those barriers that are hampering them. So on an international level, you do tend to see the McDonald's, the Coca-Cola, the Mars, the Unilever, these major brands, and these are major companies that own smaller brands as well, engage in some of these partnerships because of that level that they're at, and noticing that the global impact they have can be quite significant. So Quincy, is there often I don't want to say resistance, but is there often backlash about the fact that these are the biggest of companies that engage in these partnerships at the exclusion of other people or other organizations?
So we don't exclude anybody for ourselves. However, that said, in order to be able to have a global perspective and to have that global dialogue, it's very difficult to do that with companies that are either regional or national, right? So we've had other members in the past that the fit just wasn't entirely there because they were just too focused on one particular jurisdiction. And it's like, well, why then would they pay for somebody to fly all the way to Rome for a meeting with FAO or to Geneva for a meeting with Codex, right? So the thinking just doesn't really work or line up, right? And then you're just not going to get consensus on what things need to be done to strengthen the food supply chain. Yeah? So that is one of the challenges. Let me make a little segue here that I think might be of interest as well, which is a live situation that we're dealing with right now. So consumers are very much driven at the moment by plant-based foods, in particular, looking at flexitarian diets, right? So we're looking at people who at times may want to eat more plant-based foods, have less meat in their diet, etc., but sometimes may still very well drink milk or eat a steak, maybe just less so. There are no standards for plant-based foods at this point in time. So through the drive of Upfield, that is the former margarines business of Unilever that was spun off. Upfield is now, worked with BSI to develop a fast-track standard for plant-based foods. They were getting ready to publish it when a consumer then forced through the idea of 100% plant-based, and that document is now in as a C document within ISO. We're having a real hard time getting some consensus around this. Part of that is because of the structure of the actual committee. There's a number of quite heavily activist organizations who are very anti-meat products, trying to drive this, saying if it's plant-based, it can't have any animal-derived products in it. The challenge there is that those standards already exist. We have standards for veganism, we have standards for vegetarian foods. So why develop another one if you're basically going to say there shouldn't be or there cannot be any animal-derived ingredients in plant-based foods? So, for example, using honey as a sweetener, or using whey in order to strengthen the protein content of a particular beverage, for example. Those are some clear examples. So what we're saying is, look, you've already got your standards for veganism and vegetarianism, but in order for us to get consensus, it's very difficult to get consensus when you've got particularly European-based activist organizations who are anti any animal-derived products or ingredients. Our argument is you need to be in a position where you very clearly communicate what is actually in your food product. And if there are certain animal-derived ingredients in there, so long as the characterizing element of the product is still plant-based, that should be allowed in certain cases, so long as you clearly communicate it to the consumer. But I'm bringing up this example in order to indicate how complex and how difficult consensus building can be in an international environment. particularly when you start bringing in belief systems, which can be quite different in different parts of the world. We've done a lot of work in animal welfare. I've got a lot of examples in the animal welfare space as well. Very difficult. People looking culturally, religiously, in different parts of the world at animal welfare in very different ways. And that makes it very difficult then to develop that global harmonized system that can be extremely beneficial, but is also very difficult to get to.
Well, and as you have cultural and religious and regional differences, with foods, that's even compounded by the fact that you were talking about plant-based. Then you have cell-based and all these other types of foods, and we keep having new disruptors that are literally redefining certain foods. Whether it's beyond beef or cell cultured, lab cultured, whatever it is, foods, all these new kinds of foods end up taking on new challenges in terms of what are the standards for these. Crazy situations you have to continue to focus on as you're looking at these. Especially again, when you're looking at these companies that here's a great seller in this market, let's bring it into this market. Hold on, we can't just bring this into this market because of the whole new set of regulations that you have going on. We are almost at the end of the hour here. I want to have an opportunity for one or two more questions from the students, if there's anything there. Sometimes the students who are going to watch a recording of this end up posting questions or emailing me questions as well that they have. So if anyone has any more questions, what I'll do is, Quincy, why don't you go ahead, and what would be your big kind of takeaway in terms of if you want to work with a public-private partnership, what is something you need to make sure you understand, or a skill set you need to have, or something to avoid before you go down that road?
That's a very complicated question. What are some of the skills? I think understanding different perspectives is fundamental, and then being able to very quickly, particularly if it happens in the room, when you have different perspectives, try to find ways in order to bring that together. That is a very difficult skill. It takes time and experience to get there. Listening is a key element and a key skill amongst that as well. It's not about forcing your opinion on others. It is about understanding other people's opinions and then being able to work that, bring that together so that you can then work collaboratively to find those solutions. I think that is probably a key skill. I think in my particular case, because we are looking at a PPP that is globally driven, international experience is fundamental, right? I am lucky in the fact that I've lived in 5-6 different countries. I speak 5 languages fluently. It definitely helps. It helps build the relationships, but it also helps give a broader perspective, right? I'm not coming from a perspective, I'm from the Netherlands and our belief is X, Y, and Z around carbon emissions, and therefore we're all animal-based farming should be shut down. It's like, okay, what is that going to do to a country like Brazil or Australia or New Zealand, right? I mean, 35% of New Zealand's GDP comes from dairy, right? Are they just going to shut down their entire dairy sector? No, they're going to try to find other solutions. So again, having that international understanding and perspective is very important. And then talking to as many people as you possibly can to learn from them and then try to bring them together.
Excellent. Well, Quincy, thank you very much. We don't talk about just the sheer different level. We don't talk enough about the sheer different levels of categories between, again, governments and international, like EU, and then you have organizations, you have institutes, you have nonprofits, you have different regulatory schemes or standards, and then to look at the idea of but where does public-private partnerships sit in terms of trying to navigate some of these? And like you said quite early, the idea of building and maintaining trust between people that they might not necessarily, and institutions and entities that might not necessarily find a common ground to really build on that trust for the greater good of humanity. And that's definitely what it sounds like should be the goal of a public-private partnership. The idea that if we raise the impact for those who are within the partnerships, we definitely will raise the value, if you will, for each individual member of that partnership and well beyond them. And ultimately, whether it's the environment, whether it's society, the consumers, animal welfare, et cetera, that stands to benefit, that has to be maintained as a top priority for some of the partnerships like you're talking about. With that,
sure.
there are many more questions I'm sure that we can have along the way. And I know that some of the projects that students are working on don't necessarily align exactly with this, but when we start looking at solutions, perhaps the idea of, if it's difficult to connect this stakeholder with this stakeholder, maybe it's not about raising this one or lowering this one to meet halfway. Maybe it's finding a public-private partnership to be that entity that is halfway between these two stakeholders and allow them to work towards these common goals and to find the success, find the achievement, find the impact that they're looking at. So consider this as one of the potential options with the research you're doing in terms of the idea of maybe a public-private partnership is a solution in this arena, that if we were to do that, perhaps it may take a little bit to set it up, but the long-term gains could be far greater than any other solution that could be out there. Anyway, Quincy, Lissaur, thank you very, very much, all the way from Columbia, and to all the students who are watching this live or recording, I want to thank you as well for your time on and looking at this topic. And we'll look forward to our next event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darin. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.